Marcus Delacroix stood frozen in the marble lobby of the Meridian Grand Hotel, watching his carefully orchestrated charity gala dissolve into chaos. The woman at the reception desk was speaking in broken English, gesturing frantically at a faded photograph while tears streamed down her weathered face. Hotel security had already been called twice, and the growing crowd of elegantly dressed donors was beginning to murmur with concern and curiosity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was supposed to be the night that would cement Marcus's reputation as one of Chicago's most influential philanthropists. The annual Delacroix Foundation Gala attracted the city's elite, raising millions for underprivileged children's education. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the imported Italian marble dance floor to the celebrity chef flown in from Paris. But now, 30 minutes before the event's official start, his perfect evening was unraveling because of one confused elderly woman who refused to leave. Marcus approached the front desk where Margaret Thompson, the hotel's frazzled manager, was trying to reason with the woman. The stranger appeared to be in her 70s, with silver-gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a faded blue dress that had clearly seen better years. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched an old leather purse and what looked like a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings. "Ma'am, I understand you're looking for someone," Margaret was saying with strained patience, "but this is a private event. If you could just step outside, we can help you contact the police or social services to assist with finding your family member." The elderly woman shook her head vigorously, pointing at the photograph again. She spoke in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language, her voice growing more desperate with each attempt to communicate. Marcus caught fragments of her words, something about "my son," and 30 years, and Chicago Tribune. "What exactly is the problem here?" Marcus asked, his irritation barely concealed. He'd spent 18 months organizing this gala, and every moment of delay meant potential donors might leave before the silent auction began. Margaret turned to him with obvious relief. "Mr. Delacroix, this woman claims she's looking for her son. She's been showing this old photograph to everyone, but she doesn't seem to understand that this is a private function. Security has asked her to leave twice, but she keeps coming back." Marcus glanced at the photograph in the woman's trembling hands. It was clearly decades old, showing a young man in what appeared to be a graduation cap and gown. The image was too faded and creased for him to make out any clear features. "Ma'am," he said in the tone he typically reserved for difficult business negotiations, "I'm sure your situation is important, but this really isn't the appropriate venue. Perhaps if you contact the missing persons department at the police station." The woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed startlingly familiar, though Marcus couldn't place why. She began speaking again, more urgently this time, but her heavily accented English was difficult to understand. She kept pointing between the photograph and Marcus himself, as if trying to draw some connection that made no sense to him. "Sir," came a quiet voice from behind them. "Maybe I can help translate." Marcus turned to see Carmen Rodriguez, one of the hotel's evening custodial staff, approaching with her cleaning cart. She was a small woman, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair, tucked beneath a simple headband. Marcus had seen her countless times during his meetings at the hotel over the past year, always working efficiently and invisibly in the background, but he'd never really paid attention to her presence. "You speak whatever language she's using?" Margaret asked hopefully. "She's speaking Portuguese," Carmen said softly, mixed with some English. "I can understand most of it." She turned to the elderly woman and began speaking in fluent Portuguese, her voice gentle and reassuring. The woman's face immediately lit up with relief, and she responded rapidly, gesturing between the photograph Marcus and various newspaper clippings she pulled from her purse. As the two women conversed, Marcus found himself studying Carmen with new interest. In all their brief encounters, she'd never spoken more than a few words of polite greeting. Her English had always seemed limited, so he'd simply assumed she was another immigrant worker with minimal education. Now, listening to her speak Portuguese with obvious fluency and sophistication, he realized he'd made assumptions that were clearly incorrect. "What is she saying?" Marcus asked, checking his watch. The first wave of major donors would be arriving any moment, and he needed to be available for the crucial initial mingling period. Carmen listened for another moment before turning to him, her expression troubled. "Her name is Isabella Santos. She says she came to Chicago from Brazil 30 years ago looking for her son. She's been searching for him ever since." 30 years? Margaret repeated incredulously. That's quite a long time to be looking for someone. Carmen nodded, continuing to translate as Isabella spoke. She says her son left Brazil when he was 18 to come to university here in Chicago. They lost contact after his first year, and she's been trying to find him ever since. She worked multiple jobs, saved every penny she could, and finally managed to come to America to search for him herself. Marcus felt a strange chill run down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. Something about the woman's story seemed oddly familiar, like a half-remembered dream that lingered just beyond conscious recall. Did she say what year her son came to Chicago? Carmen asked Isabella the question and listened to her response. She says it was 1994. Her son received a scholarship to study business at Northwestern University. His name was... Carmen paused, asking for clarification. Isabella reached into her purse and pulled out what appeared to be an old acceptance letter, pointing at the name printed at the top. His name was Marcos Santos, Carmen said quietly, but she thinks he might have changed it when he came to America. Many immigrants do that, to fit in better. The chill Marcus had felt intensified into something approaching shock. Marcos Santos. He hadn't heard that name in over 25 years, not since his freshman year at Northwestern when he'd decided that Marcus Delacroix sounded more sophisticated, more American, more suited to the business world he intended to conquer. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was 12, and his mother had struggled to support them in their small Sao Paulo apartment. When the scholarship opportunity arose, 18-year-old Marco had seen it as his chance to escape poverty and build a new life in America. He'd planned to bring his mother to join him once he established himself, but those plans had been derailed by the demands of university, then internships, then his rapidly accelerating career. Phone calls had become infrequent, then ceased altogether when his mother's phone service was disconnected. His letters had gone unanswered, returned to sender from an address that no longer existed. Eventually, consumed by his new American life and the relentless pressure to succeed, he'd convinced himself that she was probably better off without him, that she'd moved on and found happiness elsewhere. Mr. Delacroix? Carmen's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you feeling all right? You look pale. Marcus stared at Isabella Santos, really seeing her for the first time. The eyes that had seemed familiar were his own eyes. The same unusual shade of green that he'd inherited from his father. The bone structure of her face, despite being aged and weathered by years of hardship, still held traces of the beautiful woman who had raised him alone in Brazil. Her hands, now gnarled with arthritis, were the same hands that had worked long hours in a textile factory to pay for his school supplies and dreamed of seeing him graduate from university. This is impossible, he whispered, taking an unconscious step backward. Carmen looked between Marcus and Isabella with growing understanding. She spoke to Isabella again in Portuguese, asking what appeared to be more specific questions about her son. Isabella's responses became more animated, and she began pulling out more items from her purse. A small photo of a young boy, what looked like a report card with Marcos Santos written at the top, and a faded letter written in Portuguese. Mr. Delacroix, Carmen said slowly. She says her son had a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. She also says he broke his arm when he was 10 years old, and it left a small scar near his elbow. Marcus unconsciously touched his left shoulder, where beneath his expensive tuxedo shirt lay the exact birthmark Carmen had described. The scar on his elbow, barely visible but still present, had indeed come from a childhood accident in Sao Paulo. The evidence was mounting beyond any possibility of coincidence. She's been carrying this photograph for 30 years, Carmen continued, her voice gentle with understanding. She says she shows it to every successful businessman she encounters, hoping someone might know what happened to her son. She believes he became very wealthy and important in Chicago, but she doesn't know his new name or how to find him. The lobby around them seemed to fade into background noise as Marcus stared at the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, sacrificed everything for his education, and then spent 3 decades searching for him across a continent. Isabella Santos looked up at him with hope and desperation, still not recognizing the 18-year-old boy she'd last seen at the Sao Paulo airport, in the successful, expensively dressed man standing before her. The newspaper clippings, Marcus managed to say. What are those? Carmen examined the yellowed papers Isabella had spread on the reception desk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. These are articles from Chicago newspapers over the years. Business section stories about successful young entrepreneurs, society pages from charity events, even some university newsletter pieces about scholarship recipients. She's been collecting any story that might mention a young Brazilian man making it big in Chicago business. Marcus looked at the clippings with a growing sense of surreal recognition. Several of them featured his own photograph, though taken years apart as his career had progressed. There was a piece from the Chicago Tribune about his first major real estate deal, another from Chicago Business Weekly, when Delacroix Enterprises had been named one of the city's fastest-growing companies. Most recently, there was a society page photo from last year's charity gala, showing Marcus accepting an award for philanthropic achievement. In every photo, Isabella had carefully drawn a circle around his face with a faded pencil, as if marking potential matches for further investigation. She'd been looking at pictures of him for years, searching for traces of the son she remembered, but the expensive suits, professionally styled hair, and confident bearing of Marcus Delacroix bore little resemblance to the awkward teenager who had left Brazil with nothing but dreams and determination. "How did she know to come here tonight?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Carmen translated the question, and Isabella responded by pointing to a small announcement in one of the newspapers she'd brought. It was a brief item about the evening's charity gala, mentioning that Marcus Delacroix of the Delacroix Foundation would be hosting the event at the Meridian Grand Hotel. Below the text was a small photograph, the same professional headshot that appeared in all of Marcus's corporate materials. "She says she's been watching the hotel for 3 days, Carmen explained, waiting for the right moment to approach. She wanted to ask Mr. Delacroix if he might know anything about young Brazilian men who came to Chicago for university in the 1990s. She thought maybe successful businessmen would know each other, that they might have networks or connections that could help her search." The irony was almost too painful to bear. Isabella had been sitting outside the hotel for days, planning to ask Marcus Delacroix for help finding Marco Santos, never suspecting they were the same person. She'd been so close to her son, waiting patiently for the chance to speak with him, while he'd been inside making final preparations for an evening of charitable giving, never imagining that the person who most needed his charity was the woman who had given him life. "Carmen," Marcus said quietly, "would you please tell her? Would you tell her that Marco Santos became Marcus Delacroix?" Carmen's eyes widened with understanding, but she nodded and gently spoke to Isabella in Portuguese. The elderly woman's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She stared at Marcus with disbelief, then joy, then heartbreak, then overwhelming emotion. She reached toward him with trembling hands, speaking rapidly in Portuguese, tears streaming down her face. "She says she knew," Carmen translated, her own voice thick with emotion. "She says she could see it in your eyes, but she was afraid to believe it. She says you look exactly like your father did when he was young, but you have her mother's eyes." Marcus stood frozen, overwhelmed by a flood of memories and emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. The successful businessman who could negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat found himself unable to form coherent words in the face of his mother's love and grief. Isabella stepped closer, and Marcus could see every line of worry and hardship that had marked her face over the 30 years of their separation. Her hands, when she finally touched his face, were rough from years of manual labor, but her touch was infinitely gentle. She spoke softly in Portuguese, the words flowing like a prayer or a lullaby. "She's telling you that she never stopped believing you were alive," Carmen translated, tears in her own eyes. "She says she worked 7 days a week for 15 years to save enough money to come to America. She learned English from library books and television shows. She says every night before she went to sleep, she prayed that she would find you, that you were safe and happy, and that someday she could hold her son again." The walls Marcus had built around his emotions, the careful distance he'd maintained from his past, crumbled completely. He found himself wrapping his arms around the small woman who had never stopped being his mother, despite his abandonment, despite his silence, despite his complete transformation into someone she wouldn't have recognized. "May," he whispered, using the Portuguese word he hadn't spoken in 30 years. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Isabella held him tightly, murmuring words of forgiveness and love that needed no translation. Around them, the hotel lobby had filled with elegantly dressed guests arriving for the charity gala. But the reunion between mother and son created its own private world where nothing else mattered. Carmen stepped back respectfully, giving them space while maintaining a protective presence. She understood better than anyone the complexity of immigrant families separated by opportunity and circumstance, the way good intentions could become years of silence, the way success could sometimes feel like betrayal of the people left behind. Margaret Thompson approached discreetly. "Mr. Delacroix, I hate to interrupt, but the event coordinator needs to speak with you about the silent auction setup. Also, Mayor Harrison has arrived and is asking for you specifically." Marcus looked up from his mother's embrace, remembering suddenly that he was the host of Chicago's most prominent charity event, that hundreds of guests were expecting him to deliver an inspiring speech about helping underprivileged children achieve their dreams. The irony was not lost on him that he'd spent months planning an event to help children succeed in America, while his own mother had been searching for him on the streets outside. "Carmen," he said, still holding Isabella's hands, "would you please stay with us? I need someone to help us communicate, and I think—" He paused, looking at the woman who had made this reunion possible. "I think you understand what this means better than anyone else here." Carmen nodded, quickly moving her cleaning cart to an inconspicuous location. "Of course, Mr. Delacroix, whatever you need. First, I need you to tell my mother that I'm not going anywhere, that we have 30 years to catch up on, and that nothing is more important to me right now than making sure she knows how much I've missed her and how sorry I am." As Carmen translated, Isabella's face lit up with a joy that transformed her completely. The worried, desperate expression she'd worn since arriving at the hotel melted away, replaced by the radiant smile Marcus remembered from his childhood. She spoke rapidly to Carmen, gesturing toward the elegant lobby and the well-dressed guests. "She says she's proud of you," Carmen translated. "She says she knew you would become someone important, someone who helps people. She wants to know about your family, whether you have children, whether you're happy." Marcus felt a pang of sadness as he realized how little his success and wealth had meant without someone to share it with. He'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a young man, but he'd never married, never had children, never built the family he'd once imagined bringing his mother to join. "Tell her that I've been successful in business, but that I never got married, because I was too focused on work. Tell her that seeing her again makes me realize that all the money and recognition in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have family to share it with." As Carmen conveyed this message, Isabella nodded with understanding that seemed to go beyond words. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph that Marcus recognized immediately. It was a picture of the two of them taken at his high school graduation in Sao Paulo, both smiling proudly at the camera, his arm around her shoulders. "She says she's carried this picture every day for 30 years, Carmen explained. "She wanted to show it to you when she found you, so you would remember how happy you both were before you had to leave." Marcus took the photograph with shaking hands, struck by how young and hopeful they both looked, how unaware they were of the decades of separation that lay ahead. "Carmen, please tell her that I want to take care of her now, that I want her to come live with me or wherever she'd be happy. Tell her that I have more than enough resources to make sure she never has to worry about anything again." Before Carmen could translate, Isabella was already shaking her head and speaking emphatically in Portuguese. Her response was lengthy and animated, and Carmen listened with growing amazement. "She says she doesn't want your money," Carmen translated slowly. "She says she came to America to find her son, not to be a burden to a successful businessman. She's been working as a housekeeper for a family in Milwaukee for the past 10 years. She has her own small apartment, her own life. She just wanted to know that you were alive and well." Marcus stared at his mother with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Even after 30 years of separation, even after decades of struggle and sacrifice, her primary concern was still his well-being, rather than her own comfort. The same selfless love that had driven her to work multiple jobs to support his education was now making her reluctant to accept the help he desperately wanted to give. "Tell her," Marcus said firmly, "that taking care of her wouldn't be charity. Tell her it would be the greatest privilege of my life, a chance to finally repay some small fraction of what she gave me. Tell her that I've spent 30 years building a successful company, but that none of it has any meaning if I can't share it with the person who made it all possible." The conversation between Carmen and Isabella continued for several minutes, with Isabella occasionally looking at Marcus with expressions that ranged from concern to love to something that might have been pride. Finally, she nodded and spoke a single word to Carmen. "She says sim," Carmen translated with a smile. "Yes, but she has conditions." "Anything," Marcus said immediately. "She wants to keep working, at least part-time. She says it's important for her to feel useful. She also wants to learn more English so she can communicate better with your business associates and friends. And she wants you to teach her about your life here, about the man you've become, so she can understand the world you've built." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, feeling more energized and hopeful than he had in years. "Yes, absolutely. We'll work out all the details. The important thing is that we're together again." A commotion near the hotel entrance interrupted their conversation. Marcus looked up to see his event coordinator, David Chen, approaching with obvious panic in his expression. "Marcus, thank God I found you," David said breathlessly. "We have a major problem with the silent auction. The auction software crashed, and we can't access any of the bidding information. The tech support company says it could take hours to restore the system, but we have 300 guests expecting to participate in bidding that's supposed to start in 20 minutes. Marcus felt the familiar surge of problem-solving adrenaline that had served him well throughout his business career, but for the first time it was tempered by something more important. He looked at Isabella, who was watching the interaction with obvious concern despite not understanding the English conversation. "Carmen, would you please explain to my mother what's happening? Tell her there's a problem with tonight's charity event, but that it's something we can solve." As Carmen translated, Isabella listened intently and then responded with what sounded like a question. "She wants to know if this event raises money to help children," Carmen said. "Yes, it's for underprivileged kids to get educational scholarships. Children from poor families who want to go to university but can't afford it." Isabella's expression grew determined as Carmen explained this. She spoke rapidly, gesturing toward the crowd of guests and then toward Marcus. "She says she wants to help," Carmen translated with surprise. "She says she knows what it's like to sacrifice everything for a child's education, and she wants these children to have the opportunities she couldn't give you." Before Marcus could respond, Isabella was already walking toward David Chen, speaking to him in her limited but determined English. "Excuse me, sir. I help you, yes. I work many charity events in Milwaukee. I know how to organize." David looked at Marcus with confusion, clearly unsure how to respond to the elderly woman in the simple dress who was offering to help solve their crisis. "David," Marcus said, making a split-second decision, "I'd like you to meet my mother, Isabella Santos. She's just arrived from Milwaukee, and she's offering to help with the auction problem." David's eyes widened with surprise, but he was too focused on the crisis to fully process the implications of Marcus's introduction. "Mrs. Santos, I appreciate the offer, but this is a very complex system. We need technical expertise to restore the bidding platform." Isabella turned to Carmen for translation, listened to the explanation, and then smiled with what looked like confidence. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook filled with handwritten notes and numbers. "She says she doesn't need computers," Carmen translated as Isabella spoke. "She says in Milwaukee she helps organize church fundraisers and community events. She knows how to run silent auctions with paper and pencils, the old-fashioned way. She says it actually works better than computers because people can see what others are bidding, and it creates more excitement." Marcus looked at his mother with renewed amazement. Even in this crisis, even in an unfamiliar environment surrounded by Chicago's social elite, Isabella was stepping forward with practical solutions and genuine desire to help. "David," Marcus said decisively, "let's try it. Get some clipboards, pens, and paper. We'll post the auction items with simple bid sheets and let people write their names and bid amounts by hand. Carmen, would you help coordinate? You can translate if we need to communicate with any Spanish or Portuguese-speaking guests." For the next 2 hours, Marcus watched his mother work with the efficiency and grace that had sustained her through 30 years of challenges. Isabella moved through the elegant crowd with quiet dignity, helping guests understand the bidding process, encouraging higher donations for worthy causes, and somehow managing to communicate warmth and enthusiasm despite the language barrier. Carmen proved equally invaluable, not only translating when needed, but demonstrating an understanding of crowd psychology and event management that surprised everyone. She suggested displaying photos of scholarship recipients alongside the auction items, creating emotional connections that drove higher bids. She organized the bid sheets by category to prevent confusion and established a rotation system so guests could view all items without creating bottlenecks. The evening that had started as a potential disaster became one of the most successful charity events in the Delacroix Foundation's history. The informal, personal approach to the auction created a sense of community and shared purpose that the high-tech system had never achieved. Guests lingered longer, bid more generously, and engaged in conversations about the scholarship recipients that led to additional spontaneous donations. Marcus delivered his scheduled speech about providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, but his words carried new depth and authenticity. He spoke about the sacrifices parents make for their children's futures, about the courage required to pursue dreams in unfamiliar places, about the importance of never forgetting where you came from or who helped you succeed. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Marcus found himself alone with Isabella and Carmen in the now quiet hotel lobby. The elegant decorations and expensive floral arrangements remained, but the space felt entirely different from the crisis zone it had been just hours earlier. "Carmen," Marcus said, "I can never adequately thank you for what you did tonight. Not just the translation, but understanding what this meant, helping make it possible." Carmen smiled modestly, already beginning to collect the scattered papers and bid sheets from the auction. "Family is the most important thing, Mr. Delacroix. When you see a chance to bring family together, you take it." Marcus watched her efficient movements and realized he'd made the same mistake tonight that he'd been making for 30 years, assuming that people's value could be measured by their job titles or social status rather than their character and capabilities. "Carmen, I have a question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. You demonstrated tonight that you have organizational skills, multilingual abilities, and natural leadership qualities that would be valuable in many different roles. Have you ever considered doing something other than custodial work?" Carmen paused in her cleaning, looking at Marcus with the same cautious expression Isabella had worn earlier when offered help. "Mr. Delacroix, I appreciate what you're saying, but I have responsibilities. I support my 3 children, and cleaning work provides steady hours and reliable income. What if I told you that the Delacroix Foundation needs a community outreach coordinator? Someone who understands different cultures, can communicate with diverse groups of people, and knows how to organize events that bring people together for good causes? The position would pay significantly more than custodial work, with full benefits and flexible scheduling around your children's needs." Isabella, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest despite understanding only parts of it, spoke to Carmen in Portuguese. Carmen responded, and they had a brief exchange that seemed to cover both practical concerns and deeper questions. "What did she say?" Marcus asked. "Your mother said that opportunities like this don't come along often, and that when God opens a door, it's usually wise to walk through it. She also said that from watching me tonight, she thinks I would be good at helping people, and that helping people is one of the most important jobs anyone can have." Marcus nodded, recognizing his mother's wisdom. "The offer stands, Carmen. No pressure, but if you're interested, we can discuss the details tomorrow." Carmen looked at Isabella, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. "I would like to hear more about it," Carmen said finally. "But I want to be clear that I'm not looking for charity. If you offer me this position, it has to be because you believe I can do the job well, not because you're grateful for tonight." "It's absolutely because I believe you can do the job well," Marcus assured her. "Tonight proved that you have skills and instincts that can't be taught. The Delacroix Foundation needs people who understand what it really means to help others succeed." As they gathered the remaining materials from the evening, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a crisis and ended with transformation. His carefully planned charity gala had become something entirely different, a genuine community effort that brought together people from different backgrounds and circumstances to support a common cause. More importantly, he'd rediscovered the most important relationship of his life and gained a new understanding of the value that exists in every person, regardless of their title or social status. Isabella had spent 30 years searching for her son, never losing faith that he was alive and successful. Carmen had spent years working quietly and efficiently, her talents unrecognized, because no one had bothered to look beyond her job description. The reunion between Marcus and Isabella was just the beginning of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted by time and circumstance. They had decades of experiences to share, wounds to heal, and dreams to plan together. But the foundation had been re-established, built on love that had never truly disappeared, and strengthened by the wisdom both had gained through their years of separation. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Isabella took Marcus's arm and spoke to him in Portuguese. Her words were soft but filled with emotion, and she squeezed his hand as she spoke. "What did she say?" Marcus asked Carmen. Carmen smiled, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "She said that losing you was the greatest sorrow of her life, but that finding you again has made every year of searching worthwhile. She said she's proud of the man you've become, not because of your success or wealth, but because tonight she saw that you still have the kind heart you had as a boy. She said she's ready to learn about your new world, but she hopes you'll also remember some things about the world you came from." Marcus felt the truth of his mother's words settle into his heart. Success had taught him to compete, to achieve, to build and acquire and accomplish. But reconnecting with Isabella reminded him of values he'd almost forgotten. The importance of family, the dignity of honest work, the power of love that persists across any distance or time. As they walked together toward the hotel exit, Marcus realized that this wasn't just the end of a successful charity event. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where success would be measured not just by financial achievements, but by the relationships he nurtured and the opportunities he created for others to find their own paths home. The millionaire who had started the evening focused solely on raising money for underprivileged children was ending it with a profound understanding that sometimes the people who most need help are the ones standing right in front of us, invisible only because we haven't learned to truly see them. Isabella had been searching for her son for 30 years, but it was Carmen who had the wisdom and courage to help her find him, proving once again that the most important gifts often come from the most unexpected sources. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus's penthouse apartment, casting golden light across the pristine marble floors and designer furniture that had once represented the pinnacle of his success. Now, as he watched Isabella move carefully through the space, her weathered hands trailing along the expensive surfaces with wonder and hesitation, he saw his home through entirely different eyes. Isabella had spent the night in the guest suite, but Marcus had barely slept, his mind racing with questions and memories that demanded attention after 30 years of carefully constructed silence. How many nights had she lain awake wondering if he was alive? How many times had she walked past buildings in Milwaukee or Chicago, wondering if her son might be inside, living a life she could never imagine? Carmen had stayed late the previous evening, helping Isabella and Marcus navigate their first real conversation in 3 decades. The translation had been more than linguistic. Carmen had served as a cultural bridge, explaining context and nuance that mere words couldn't convey. When Isabella had finally retired to sleep, Carmen had quietly given Marcus her personal phone number, understanding that the reunion was only the beginning of a much longer journey. Now, in the clear light of morning, the magnitude of what needed to be rebuilt between them felt both overwhelming and precious. Isabella stood at the window overlooking Lake Michigan, her simple nightgown and robe a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. She was speaking softly in Portuguese, and Marcus realized with a pang that he was already losing the thread of his native language. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Bom dia, May," he said, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. Isabella turned with a smile that transformed her entire face. She responded in rapid Portuguese, her eyes bright with affection, and Marcus felt his heart sink as he caught only fragments of what she was saying. "I'm sorry," he said in English, then switched to halting Portuguese. "Desculpe-me, my Portuguese is not good anymore." Isabella's expression grew understanding rather than disappointed. She reached for his hand and spoke more slowly, her words deliberate and clear. Marcus recognized enough to understand that she was telling him not to worry, that language was less important than being together, that they would find ways to communicate. But Marcus felt the loss acutely. The language of his childhood, The words his mother had sung to him as lullabies, the stories she'd told him about their family history, all of it had been sacrificed in his determination to become fully American. He'd thought it was necessary for success, but now it felt like another wall between them. The sound of the doorbell interrupted his self-recrimination. Marcus glanced at his watch, surprised to see it was only 7:30 in the morning. Through the intercom, he heard Carmen's voice, apologetic but determined. "Mr. Delacroix, I'm sorry to come so early, but I wanted to check on you and Mrs. Santos before I had to go to work. Also, I brought some things that might help." Marcus buzzed her up, grateful for her thoughtfulness. When Carmen arrived, she was carrying several shopping bags and wearing the same practical clothes he'd seen her in countless times at the hotel. But her demeanor had subtly shifted. There was a confidence in her bearing that hadn't been visible when she'd been pushing a cleaning cart. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Carmen said as Marcus let her in. "I know this is a very personal time for you both." Isabella appeared from the living room, her face lighting up at the sight of Carmen. She embraced the younger woman warmly, speaking in Portuguese with obvious gratitude and affection. Carmen responded fluently, and Marcus found himself once again marveling at the ease with which she navigated between languages and cultures. "What is she saying?" Marcus asked, already dreading his dependence on translation. "She's thanking me for helping you find each other," Carmen explained. "She's also saying that she prayed all night for guidance about how to reconnect with you, and that seeing you this morning made her realize how much healing needs to happen between you both." Carmen set down her shopping bags and began unpacking their contents with practiced efficiency. "I brought some Brazilian coffee, the kind she's probably used to. Also some ingredients for pão de açúcar and brigadeiros, foods that might taste like home to her. And this," she held up a Portuguese-English dictionary and a set of language-learning CDs, "might help you both meet in the middle." Marcus felt a wave of gratitude that went far beyond the practical gifts. Carmen had understood something fundamental about their situation, that rebuilding a relationship across 3 decades in 2 languages would require patience, effort, and small gestures that honored both their past and present. "Carmen, you've already done so much for us. You don't need to." "Mr. Delacroix," Carmen interrupted gently, "family reunions are complicated, especially when there's been so much time and distance. In my experience, the practical things, food, language, shared activities, can be bridges while you're working on the emotional things." Isabella had been listening to their exchange with obvious concentration, picking up words she recognized. She spoke to Carmen, who nodded and translated. "She wants to know if you have to work today, if there are business obligations that might take you away from her. She's worried that you'll disappear into your busy life and she'll lose you again." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He realized that from Isabella's perspective, his success might seem like another barrier between them, rather than something to celebrate. The wealth and status he'd accumulated could easily become obstacles to the simple connection she was seeking. "Tell her," Marcus said carefully, "that I'm canceling everything on my calendar for the next 2 weeks. Tell her that nothing is more important than the time we have together now." As Carmen conveyed this message, Isabella's relief was palpable. She reached for Marcus's hands, speaking earnestly in Portuguese, her eyes filling with tears. "She says she doesn't want to be a burden on your life," Carmen translated. "She says she came to find you, not to disrupt the world you've built. But she also says that she's been waiting 30 years for the chance to know her son again, and she hopes you want to know her too." Marcus felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Tell her that she could never be a burden. Tell her that I want to learn everything about her life, about what she's been doing all these years, about the woman she became while I was gone." What followed was the first of many conversations that would shape their rebuilding relationship. With Carmen's patient assistance, Isabella began to share the story of her 3 decades in America, the early years of desperate searching, the gradual acceptance that she might never find her son, the slow process of building a life in Milwaukee while never abandoning hope. She had worked as a housekeeper for the Kowalski family for 10 years, caring for their elderly patriarch while his children lived their busy lives in distant cities. The work was steady and respectful, and the Kowalskis had become a surrogate family of sorts, celebrating her birthdays and including her in holiday gatherings. But always, she had continued her search, saving money from every paycheck to fund trips to Chicago, where she believed her son had stayed after university. She says the hardest part wasn't the work or the loneliness, Carmen translated as Isabella's story continued. It was not knowing if you were happy. She says she could accept never seeing you again if she just knew that you had found peace and success, that leaving Brazil had given you the life you dreamed of. Marcus found himself sharing his own story in return, though his version felt painfully shallow compared to Isabella's years of sacrifice and hope. He told her about his university years, the pressure to assimilate and succeed, the gradual abandonment of his Brazilian identity in favor of American ambition. He explained how his early attempts to contact her had failed, how the silence had eventually seemed easier than the guilt of his neglect. "I convinced myself that you were better off without me," he admitted, through Carmen's translation. "I thought that if I became successful enough, wealthy enough, I could eventually come back to Brazil and find you, give you everything you'd ever wanted. But the more successful I became, the harder it seemed to bridge the gap. I was afraid you wouldn't forgive me for staying away so long." Isabella listened to this explanation with expressions that cycled through understanding, sadness, and something that might have been recognition. When she responded, her words were gentle but firm. "She says that success without family is like a beautiful house with no one to live in it," Carmen translated. "She says she's proud of what you've accomplished, but that she always hoped you would remember that love is more important than money, that connection is more valuable than recognition." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone, which had been buzzing insistently for the past hour. He'd been ignoring it, but the repeated calls suggested genuine urgency. When he finally answered, his assistant Jessica's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. "Marcus, thank God, where are you? The Morrison Group has been trying to reach you since 6 a.m. They want to move the merger meeting to this afternoon instead of next week. This could be the biggest deal of the year, but they need confirmation in the next 2 hours or they're walking away." Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that major business deals always triggered, but for the first time in his career, it was tempered by something more important. He looked at Isabella, who was watching his phone conversation with obvious concern, understanding enough to recognize the urgency in Jessica's voice. "Jessica, I need you to call Morrison and tell them I can't make this afternoon. Reschedule for next week as originally planned, or they can work with one of the other firms they're considering." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. "Marcus, this is a $120 million acquisition. We've been working toward this for 8 months. You can't just—" "I can, and I am," Marcus said firmly. "If Morrison Group wants to work with Delacroix Enterprises, they'll respect my schedule. If they don't, we'll find other opportunities." After he hung up, Isabella spoke to Carmen with obvious concern. The translation revealed her worry that she was already interfering with his business, causing problems that might hurt his career. "Tell her," Marcus said, "that there will always be another business deal, another opportunity to make money, but there's only one chance to rebuild our relationship, only one opportunity to make up for 30 years of lost time. Tell her that choosing her over a business meeting is the easiest decision I've ever made." Carmen's translation of this message brought fresh tears to Isabella's eyes, but they were tears of joy and relief rather than sorrow. She spoke rapidly to Carmen, gesturing toward Marcus with obvious pride and affection. "She says that now she knows for certain that you grew up to be a good man," Carmen explained. "She says that all those years of worrying about whether you'd lost your values in pursuit of success, all those prayers that you would remember what really matters, they've been answered." Over the following days, Carmen became an essential part of their reconstruction process. She arrived each morning before work and returned each evening, helping facilitate conversations that gradually grew more natural and less dependent on formal translation. She brought photo albums from her own immigrant experience, sharing stories that helped Isabella and Marcus understand that their situation, while unique in its specifics, was part of a larger pattern of families separated and reunited by the demands of pursuing the American dream. Carmen also served as a cultural interpreter in ways that went beyond language. She helped Marcus understand that Isabella's insistence on contributing to household tasks wasn't stubbornness, but a deep-seated need to feel useful and valued. She explained to Isabella that Marcus's expensive lifestyle wasn't necessarily a rejection of their modest Brazilian roots, but rather a manifestation of success in a culture that measured achievement differently. "Your mother comes from a world where wealth is shared and family comes first," Carmen explained to Marcus one evening. "Your success is wonderful, but she needs to understand how it can serve love rather than replace it. These insights proved crucial as Marcus and Isabella navigated the practical aspects of building a shared life. Isabella had initially resisted Marcus's offers to pay for anything, viewing them as charity rather than family support. But with Carmen's help, they found ways to structure their relationship that honored both Isabella's independence and Marcus's desire to care for her. Isabella would continue working part-time for the Kowalski family in Milwaukee, but she would spend half of each month in Chicago with Marcus. He would provide a comfortable apartment near his own building, close enough for daily contact but separate enough for her to maintain her autonomy. Most importantly, they would both commit to rebuilding their relationship slowly and honestly, acknowledging the hurt and loss of their separation while focusing on the love that had endured. Carmen's own transformation became intertwined with theirs. Marcus's offer of a position with the Delacroix Foundation proved to be perfect timing, as her youngest child was starting high school and no longer needed the same level of after-school supervision. The community outreach coordinator role allowed her to use her multilingual skills and cultural knowledge to connect with immigrant families seeking educational opportunities for their children. Her first major project was developing a family reunification support program, inspired directly by Marcus and Isabella's experience. The program would provide translation services, cultural orientation, and practical assistance for families separated by immigration, economic necessity, or other circumstances beyond their control. "There are so many families like yours," Carmen explained to Marcus as they planned the program. "Parents who sacrificed everything for their children's education, children who achieved success but lost connection with their roots, siblings separated by borders and opportunity. The foundation could help bridge these gaps, not just with money, but with understanding and practical support." Marcus embraced the idea enthusiastically, recognizing that his personal experience had given him insight into needs he'd never previously considered. The foundation's traditional focus on educational scholarships remained important, but expanding to include family support services felt like a natural evolution of their mission. Isabella became the program's first success story, and eventually one of its most valuable advocates. Her experience searching for her son, combined with her natural empathy and newly developed English skills, made her an ideal mentor for other parents facing similar separations. She began volunteering at the Foundation's offices, sharing her story with families who needed hope that reunion was possible even after years of silence. The work gave Isabella a sense of purpose that went beyond her personal happiness at finding Marcus. She was helping other families avoid the pain she'd experienced, ensuring that cultural and language barriers wouldn't prevent love from finding its way home. Marcus found that his business success took on new meaning when it was connected to these more personal goals. The wealth he'd accumulated became a tool for healing and connection, rather than just accumulation and status. His network of contacts proved valuable in unexpected ways, as other successful immigrants began sharing their own stories of family separation and gradual reconnection. The Morrison Group deal, which had seemed so crucial when Jessica called that first morning, was eventually completed on Marcus's terms, proving that integrity and family priorities could coexist with business success. But more importantly, the experience taught Marcus that his worth wasn't determined solely by his ability to close deals or accumulate wealth. 6 months after their reunion, Marcus and Isabella were featured in a Chicago Tribune article about immigrant families and the American dream. The story highlighted their separation and reunion, but also focused on the broader work they were doing through the foundation to support other families facing similar challenges. In the photograph accompanying the article, Marcus and Isabella stood together in the foundation's offices, surrounded by families who had benefited from their programs. Carmen was visible in the background, facilitating a conversation between a recently arrived mother from El Salvador and her son who had been living in Chicago for 5 years without contact. The image captured something that went beyond individual success or even family reunion. It showed the ripple effects of love and understanding, the way one family's healing could become a source of hope and practical help for countless others. Isabella had found her son, but in the process, she had also found a community of people who understood her journey. Marcus had rediscovered his mother, but he had also learned to see success as a responsibility to lift others, rather than just an achievement to celebrate alone. Carmen had been promoted from cleaning staff to program coordinator, but more importantly, she had discovered that her instincts for understanding people and solving problems were valuable skills that could be applied to helping families heal and grow. The cleaning lady, who had recognized the connection between a desperate mother and a successful son, had become the architect of a program that would eventually help hundreds of families find their way back to each other. Her willingness to step forward in that hotel lobby had created not just one reunion, but a model for healing that would extend far beyond anything she could have imagined. The millionaire, who had thought he was hosting a charity gala, had instead learned that the most important charity begins with recognizing the worth and potential in every person we encounter, regardless of their job title or social status. His foundation's work expanded to include not just educational scholarships, but family support services, cultural preservation programs, and initiatives designed to help immigrants maintain connections with their heritage while building new lives in America. The story of Marcus and Isabella's reunion spread through Chicago's immigrant communities, not as a fairy tale, but as proof that persistence, love, and the willingness of strangers to help could overcome even decades of separation. Their example inspired other successful immigrants to examine their own family relationships and consider how their achievements could serve purposes beyond personal advancement. In the end, the greatest transformation wasn't Marcus's rediscovered relationship with his mother or Isabella's relief at finally finding her son. It was the recognition that success without connection is empty, that wealth without wisdom is meaningless, and that the most profound changes often begin with the simple willingness to truly see and value every person whose life intersects with our own. The cleaning lady had pointed out more than a family connection that night in the hotel lobby. She had illuminated the truth that everyone carries hidden potential, everyone deserves recognition and respect, and everyone has something valuable to contribute when given the opportunity to shine. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones we walk past every day without noticing, and that the greatest wealth is measured not in dollars accumulated but in relationships nurtured, opportunities created, and love shared across any distance or difference that tries to divide us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.